Okay, finally. Sorry, we're a little late. I'm Helen Avery, and I'll be with you tonight for the next hour as we gaze at Orion this evening. So, sorry for the late start. Paul Cox, our astronomer extraordinaire, is ill at the moment, so flying solo on the technical front and trying our hardest. So, thanks for joining us this evening. And here we are, just looking at the screen right now. So you can see, if you're on the livecast page with me, you'll be seeing a slate, what's called a slate screen, with a picture of me and a thing that says Constellation Stories. And I'm going to switch that picture up just to give you a real look at some of the gems of Orion. So bear with me while I just switch that over. Here we go. So hopefully you can see this wonderful picture as it's about to change. This is a part one of a two-part discussion where we're looking at Orion. We'll be back next week, but really you could look at Orion for several weeks. So I wanted to start off with this amazing photograph by Rogelio Bernal Andro of the constellation from Orion. There it is, from head to toe. That's the name of the photo. And it was actually taken in 2010. It was the astronomy picture of the day, but I'm a bit late to the party and I found it this week, and I've just really been blown away by the richness of some of the objects here in Orion. You know, we often look up and we just look at the belt, or, you know, we can make out the other stars around it, and we can sort of work out where our hunter is. But we often don't know just how rich this constellation is. You know, sometimes with the naked eye in light polluted areas, we don't get to appreciate it. And even if we're not not in light polluted areas, we don't see this level of detail. So I put this up in Illuminations and a link, so you can actually go and click on this photograph and zoom in on each of these elements, which is really wonderful. And I know that some of the members on the website are sort of thinking or talking about maybe doing a mosaic themselves of parts of Orion, and maybe we could put it all together and have something of this. So as I say, this photo really captured my imagination, because to me, you can't help but look at this photo and feel that this constellation is mythic, like epically mythic, if that's even a term. So I just thought I'd run through very briefly some of the objects here, and just to let you know, Chile's online this evening, and if you just quickly pop on that, you'll catch the last minute, because we're late, of Betelgeuse. So there's a tab underneath Chile Widefield Canaries. It's got some weather, and it's just gone, but we're returning to Betelgeuse at the end. Okie doke. So I'm just going to put back to the livecast screen, to the main screen, so we can see the picture that I was just talking about. I'm trying to get back there. So what we'll notice is, you know, Betelgeuse, we see the shoulders of Orion. So we can see Betelgeuse and Bellatrix. Bellatrix is the right shoulder, and actually this is the star we're looking at now on Chile. But if you're with me on the sort of main slate page in the space situation room, then you'll hopefully be looking at this beautiful picture. So not only is, you'll see the head of Orion that's in between the two shoulders. It's these three stars up in the middle in the sort of reddish cloud, and we'll be having a peek at that later. That's the head of Orion. We don't often think about the head of Orion. Then, of course, we have the belt. We're all very familiar with the belt, those three stars in the middle, or are they? And they're actually part of a much larger star cluster called Colander 70. It's about 100 stars in there. We'll talk a bit about that later. And on the left, sort of the left belt, which is really sort of right on Orion, but left as we're facing it, just above Alnitak, that star's called, you've got the Flame Nebula. A little above that, even more sort of going up to about 11 o'clock, we've got the Reflection Nebula, M78. Underneath Down Attack, we've got the Horsehead Nebula coming down a little further, following that line down. We have the amazing Great Orion Nebula that we're going to have a peek at next week. Coming down even further, we've got Rigel on the right. That's like the foot of Orion. On the left foot, we've got Safe, that star we don't often talk about. And then back over by Rigel, we've got this Witchhead Nebula that sort of bumps up against another constellation, the river Eridanus. And so much more involved in this this wonderful constellation that we could talk about for weeks and weeks and weeks. But tonight, we're going to sort of take the belt upwards. That is the plan. Okay. Okie doke. So just bear with me. I'm just moving. Okay, so we started with Betelgeuse. So unfortunately, we just missed it because we were running a bit late. But as I said, we're coming back to it later. And Betelgeuse, it's a beautiful reddish color. It's the second apparent brightest star in Orion, even though it's the alpha star. And it's 642 light years away, and it's been described as like ruddy and russet. And it's the 9th brightest star in our sky, although it's a variable star, so sometimes it's 7th brightest, sometimes it's 20th. And it's 10 million years old, which isn't actually that old in the scheme of things, in cosmic years anyway. And it is enormous Betelgeuse, and very visible to the naked eye. We can sort of tend to sort of notice the belt and then Betelgeuse above it. And if it were at the centre of our solar system, so if it took the place of the sun, its surface would extend past the asteroid belt, wholly engulfing the orbits of Mercury, Venus, Earth, our planet, Mars, and even possibly Jupiter. I mean, it's just phenomenal, the size of it. And it's called the Betelgeuse, sort of means like the armpit of the giant. It's also which is very apt because it's sort of on the shoulder, but could also be the armpit, even though it's not a particularly attractive name. It's also been known to be called the Announcer, and that's because in the northern hemisphere, it's like the brightest star of Orion to emerge above the horizon. So it sort of announced Orion coming. It's also known as the Marshall Star, and that's sort of seen because Orion is like a hunter or a warrior. And indeed, this we're going to talk about this tonight from a Greek and Roman and Egyptian standpoint, and next week we're going to look at sort of South Pacific, Australia, Native American, New Zealand and Hawaiian sort of depictions of how they saw Orion, which is very different. But tonight we're kind of focusing on this idea of Orion as the hunter, as this sort of giant. Betelgeuse is the armpit of the giant. So to the Greeks and Romans, he's this hunter, and he's stood with one foot in or on, as we'll discover later, the river Eridanus, and he's facing the mighty bull. And in his raised hand that comes out of Betelgeuse, he wields like a club, and in the other that just came from Bellatrix, the star we just looked at, the female warrior, he holds aloft a shield draped with a lion's pelt, although I see it more as a bow. I'd love to hear what you see it as. So this is really where the story of Orion begins, and I just want to sort of draw your attention. We're actually looking at now through Chile, Colander 69, and this is his head. The bright star we can see sort of in the middle here is Lambda Orionis, also known as Mesa, the head of the giant, that means. And then under it, sort of what makes up sort of a triangle of Orion's head is Phi 1, Phi 2. And we're sort of, not we're sort of seeing it from Chile's point of view, so it's a bit sort of hard to see the other stars. But those three that you see in the middle, that almost look like Orion's belt themselves, that's Colander 69, and I like to think of it as like a scar on Orion's face, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as the stories come out a little later. This head of Orion, in which we can see this Colander 69, these three stars, is is known to the Hindus, was known as the antelope's head, and that's because Orion wasn't seen as a hunter, he was seen as a stag. So the story there is that the Lord of created beings fell in love with his daughter, so she turned into a dove to escape him, and he turned himself into a stag to pursue her, but was shot by the star Sirius. So a similar story to one regarding Orion and the Pleiades that we'll talk about in a moment, and this idea of this sort of mythical hunt taking place. So sort of back to the story. So Orion, some people say this constellation sort of began the origins around 2000 BC, but how can we ever really know? I mean, it's such a familiar sight and unique sight in the sky, these three stars, that I'm sure humans have been sort of attributing stories to these collection of stars for millennia. But and some say 5000 BC, but as I say, who knows? And while our hunter strikes like a very impressive pose in the sky, if you've ever seen pictures of Orion as the hunter, he almost looks heroic. He's not actually really a hero, at least not by the time we reach the Greco-Roman period. And by now he's actually been demeaned from the title of mighty hunter or light of heaven, as he was known in the Euphrates, to more of like a foolish hunter, actually, and almost sort of the dimwit of heaven, if you can believe that. I know it's not something we often think about. We look at Orion and say, there he is, the mighty hunter, but the Greco-Roman stories is kind of a fool. And in fact, the Hebrew word for Orion means fool or impious one. So who fathered Orion? And this is kind of really the start of the story of Orion, and there's some conflicting opinion. So one Greek tale claims he was the son of the king Hyria. One day Zeus, Hermes and Poseidon were travelling through Earth and were hosted very graciously by this king. And to thank him, the three gods promised to grant Hyrius whatever he wanted. And what King Hyrius, who had been blessed with 12 daughters, wanted more than anything in the world was a son. So the three gods took the hide of a cow, urinated on it, and buried it. And 9 months later, Orion emerged. So an unusual story, but some say that his name initially was Orion, meaning urine-born. So not the most glamorous. Here we have the armpit of the giant and the urine-born, as he is, and he's sort of, as I say, depicted as a bit of a fool in this story. So Orion, as born of the gods, possessed some of their superpowers. So Poseidon, god of the seas and oceans, had granted Orion the ability to walk on water, and that's kind of why we see him with 1 foot on the river Eridanus. And Zeus had passed on his handsome looks and the stature of a giant, while Hermes had given him tremendous athletic ability, the ability of a warrior. But he also inherited a few other more questionable tendencies from his collection of parents, which is apt. We're now sort of hopefully going to come into view in Chile, the Horsehead Nebula. So an eerie, dark nebula that we'll talk about in a moment, but I just want to continue with this story. So he inherited some sort of, as I say, some not so likable traits. We would perhaps say he wasn't a stable genius. He was actually a bit of a brute and believed he could get whatever he wanted, Orion. And what he wanted as a young man was Merope, the daughter of the king of Chios, who we better know as one of the Pleiades. And now we're sort of beginning to see this dark nebula come into the middle of our screen. That's the Horsehead Nebula. And the Horsehead Nebula is below our Nitak, as I mentioned earlier, the third star in Orion's belt, or the one to the left, as we see in the northern hemisphere. So he wants Merope, and in order to win her hand, Orion, with his trusty hunting dogs, so Canis Major, Canis Minor, hunted and killed every wild animal in the kingdom of Chios. But the king was still not prepared to hand over his daughter. And so one night, Orion, lustful after several flagons of wine, climbs up into Merope's bedroom and rapes her. And the king is furious, understandably, as his daughter is just broken. And he calls on the gods to take revenge on Orion. And one god here is the god of darkness. They're very apt. We're looking at this dark nebula right now. The god of darkness, Erebus, he is the king of Chios, and creeps up on Orion while he's sleeping and slashes his eyes, cutting his cheek, which is where I sort of artistic license here, just so I can bring in Colander 69 as maybe a scar on our Orion's face. But he cuts his eyes and he blinds him. So when Orion wakes to find himself blind, he's obviously mortified. Not because he realizes his terrible deeds, but because he's furious at the king for having punished him. So he goes on this journey and seeks out Hephaestus, the god of fire, who give him a dwarf to carry on his shoulder to act as his eyes. Really bizarre, and as far as I'm aware, the only tale in the constellations that contains a dwarf, but maybe I'll discover more later. And together they are sent to the top of the highest mountain to wait for dawn, wait for the sun to come. So just pausing here and looking at this beautiful Horsehead Nebula while we pause in this story. And I don't know about you, but I don't always see a horse head. In some pictures, I actually see almost like an Incredible Hulk, which I kind of like to think of as Orion sort of stumbling blindly with this dwarf on his shoulder. Or sometimes I see like a seahorse, or even a Loch Ness monster, which is appropriate because this particular nebula was discovered by a Scottish astronomer in 1888 and a woman, Wilhelmina Fleming. So it's, as mentioned, it's a dark nebula, which is a type of interstellar cloud that's so dense that it obscures the light from objects behind it. And it's about 1,500 light years away. So I wonder what you see in this. Maybe you see a horse head, or maybe you see like a swaggering giant with a dwarf on his shoulder making his way up a mountain. So they arrive, this motley crew, at the top of the mountain, and say they wait for dawn. And when the sun rises, it beams on Orion's eyes and he regains his sight. So with his sight regained, he then decides to seek revenge on the king. So not really learning much, is he? And goes in search of him to kill him. But the king of Chios has been hidden by his countrymen beneath the earth. So eventually Orion gives up and begins an entirely different tale by heading to the island of Crete. And you may be more familiar with this story. So at Crete, he catches the eye, Orion, of another amazing hunter or huntress, Artemis, who's also the moon goddess. And she falls in love with Orion, and together they roam the forests hunting, Orion with his club and Artemis with her bow and arrow. But Artemis's brother Helios, or Apollo Helios, as he's known sometimes, and then he becomes Apollo to the Romans, knowing of Orion's kind of shady past, he disapproves of the relationship between his sister and Orion. So one morning after Orion walks out onto the water to the middle of a lake and starts to bathe, Apollo directs the sun's rays onto him, like enveloping him in a golden light. And then he calls on his sister, who can't see that Orion is beneath this light, and challenges her to show her skill in archery by shooting an arrow into the light in the middle of the lake from her place on the shoreline. So completely unwittingly, and to show her prowess, Artemis sends like a winged shaft into the body of Orion, her lover, striking him dead. And when she realizes what's happened and what her brother's done, and that she's been tricked and it's actually Orion she's killed, stricken with grief, she begs Zeus to put Orion among the stars so she can gaze upon him every night as she drives her silver chariot through the skies. Now there are other stories that sort of link on to this one. I've tried to sort of mash them all up, but some you can't just sort of shoehorn together. And one is that Orion, sort of rewinding all the way back to the beginning of the story, wasn't just seeking out Merope, but actually all the sisters of the Pleiades. And so to protect them, Zeus put Taurus, the bull, between the Pleiades and Orion. So that's why we have this sort of lovely image of Orion the hunter. Well, in the northern hemisphere we do, of Orion the hunter facing the bull, and then the Pleiades, you know, within Taurus, just behind that lovely Aldebaran red eye of the bull. Or not far from Aldebaran, relatively speaking. And another story, this time associated with a different zodiacal constellation, is that Orion arrives on Chios to impress the king, and begins to kill the wild animals there. And then coming back one day from the forest with a lion's pelt in his hand, Orion boasts that no animal is strong enough or swift enough to escape him. And to punish his vanity and his pride, the gods send a scorpion to spring from the sandy earth beneath his feet and sting him, bite him, kills him instantly. And this is a story that many of us are familiar with. I know I put out on a discussion group earlier this week asking people what they felt about Constellation Orion, what did they know about it, and a couple of people said that to them it was this story, the story of the scorpion, that they knew most about Orion. And tellers of this particular tale will say that this is why when Scorpio rises, the constellation Scorpio rises above the eastern horizon, Orion sinks, like dies below the western horizon, like a vanquished warrior. And then in another zodiacal related story that's part of this story, it's Ophiuchus, the 13th zodiacal constellation, actually comes and heals Orion, and Orion lives to see another day. So much richness, even just from one culture, so many different stories. And I just wanted to read something from a lovely book I got for Christmas. It's from 1940s. It's called The Stars in Myth and Fact. But it says this about Orion. And the old astro-religion, I love that there was an astro-religion, taught that mental wealth is accomplished by mastery, both over environment and over the self. The warrior, Orion, was fully equipped. You know, he was girt about with strength. He carried his shield of lion skin, a symbol of fiery energy. His upraised club was designed to represent the natural law, and by his side hung his sword of knowledge, and his foot was in the water of perpetual youth. It was there in the river Eridanus. Yet he failed of complete attainment. His success was hindered by his boasting pride, which I just love. What a beautiful lesson. And I thought quite topical that sometimes humility is called for when one is in a powerful position. So here we are. We're now switching to the belt. We're going to take a look at the sword that hangs from the belt next week, but we will come back to the belt in sort of the southern hemisphere stories next week. But I wanted to have a good look at these. So this is Mintaka, which is sort of what we would see the top right in the northern hemisphere. That is the highest on the top right of the belt. I'm just going to see if I can switch images if you're looking on YouTube at the moment. I just wanted to switch up to Orion's belt. Let's see. Here we go. And I have nabbed this from wonderful Dave L, who took this with Aladdin and was actually, it was in reference to something else that he posted this, because we're talking about this Barnard's loop that's on the left here, this sort of semicircular crescent shaped gaseous area. But I thought it just showed perfectly the belt So I just thought I would pull that up, but of course feel free to stay on Chile and take in Mintaka. A couple of things I wanted to share with you about Mintaka before we get going on the belt. It's 915 light years away. It's a B-type giant, and it's 90,000 times more luminous than the Sun, 20 times more massive. It actually, interstellar matter, out of which new stars are born, was discovered in 1904 by looking at this star, which is kind of beautiful to think about. And we can see the colour coming in now. It's almost like a kind of purpley blue, which is lovely. And we're going to be going through the belt for the next 15 minutes or so. So we're going to switch to Al Nilam and then Al Nitak. So Mintaka is actually, it means the belt. Al Nilam means string of pearls, and Al Nitak means the girdle. So they're all kind of referring to this belt, although not everyone sees this as a belt. Certainly we'll talk about that next week. But I also kind of like to think about it as maybe the arrow that sort of shoots through Orion's stomach from Artemis. And it is actually seen as an arrow in some traditions, or the darts of an arrow. So another way of looking at not the belt, but actually the arrow that kills Orion. Okay. But the belt. So we think it's 3 stars. But actually, it's about 100. It's Colander 70 is the cluster. We can see about 70 of these stars through the binoculars, but obviously we're most familiar with these 3 bright ones we're looking at this evening. And no one really realised that the belt was an open star cluster until Colander came along in 1931 and declared it so. And it spans about 50 light years, the whole cluster, so it's pretty big. And actually, when you get a close-up look, you can see that the stars sort of weave in and around these 3 main stars, or that's how they appear to. And I had Colander 70 set up on Canary scopes, but obviously we're suffering some weather, so we're not able to see that tonight. But I recommend setting up a mission to Colander 70 so you can really see this. And we can kind of see this in this picture that I've put up on the sort of main page. You can see a lot more of the stars. They do kind of form, some swirls around the stars. And this is what's referred to as the bands of Orion in the Bible, in Job. So when you get a good look at Colander 70, you can actually see it does kind of feel like not only a belt, like a band, but also there's these swirls around it that seems sort of like a serpent almost around it that feels like a band, I guess. So yes, it's mentioned, so famous, this asterism. I mean, just probably the most famous out there. Mentioned in the Bible a few times actually, but the bands of Orion mentioned in Job. And the most in-depth description about the belt in one place I've read is in Stephen James O'Meara's Deep Sky Companions, The Secret Deep, that Slooh astronomer Lewis turned me on to earlier this week through a discussion board. And I'm thrilled that I ended up with this book. It's just really, really juicy. And a lot of his discussion about the belt and what it was known as is actually to do with the southern hemisphere, so we'll explore that in more detail next week. But what I love is this idea of stories within stories. So we have Orion, the whole constellation, which has a story of his own, and then the belt comes with stories of its own. So it's not just thought of as the belt, as I sort of alluded to. They've also been called the 3 wise men. So actually, these 3 stars, and now we've moved on to Al Nilam, a string of pearls. These 3 stars were seen as the Magi who followed the Star of Bethlehem. So kind of amazing to look up and see that story up there for some. For others, they were known as the Golden Nuts. They were seen as 3 walnuts. Apparently, in in some parts of like Babylonia, around that area. The three kings was another, that kind of makes sense. We three kings of Orion are similar to the three wise men, the Magi. They were seen as these three kings making a journey. The three mowers, apparently, in the book I mentioned earlier, The Stars in Myth and Fact. The Maasai tribe in Africa called them the three old men, with the sword that we'll look at next week being three old widows who are chasing these old men. It's like randy old ladies chasing these three guys. In China, Orion, actually, the word for Orion is San, and it means the three. So even the whole constellation is based off these three stars. Elsewhere, the three pigs, the yard, as the line joining them, is 3 degrees long, says William Olcott. In Greenland, they're called the seal hunters, and they're seen to be lost at sea. And some say it wasn't a belt at all, but they represent the arrow shot through the middle, killing him. And so, as I mentioned, next week we'll talk about the belt from a southern hemisphere perspective, and indeed an indigenous perspective, which is a lot of fun because it sort of turns on its head many of the things that we talk about. Wow, and really some beautiful colour coming through now on our nilam, and it does look like a pearl, doesn't it? You can sort of imagine that they are indeed a string of pearls. And I'd be remiss really not to mention the connection to the pyramids of Giza and these three stars. So there are some imaginative and inspiring suggestions about the orientation of the belt stars and the pyramids. But as yet, there's not really the solid evidence to suggest that is the case. But I don't know about you, but I love archaeoastronomy, and I'm all for hypotheses about old sort of buildings connecting with positions in the sky. So I'm very supportive of these kinds of stories. And to be honest, we're just creating more myths. They're just more stories, so it's beautiful. But yeah, not much evidence actually to sort of back that up. Although I'm sure there are many people who disagree with me, and I'm happy to listen to that, because as I say, I'd love to be convinced. Okay. So what can I tell you about Anilam? It's a B-type supergiant, 40 times more massive than our sun, and this star produces winds of up to 2,000 kilometers a second, and also lights a dim reflection nebula, NGC 1990, which we're not able to see tonight. And now we are moving on to Alnitak, probably the star that most people can name. So I did a Twitter poll earlier, just to see if people could name these three stars. So I just want to pull up on the main page the results of that, so you can see. Now, I have to confess that I didn't know the names of the stars in Orion's belt before I started really looking into it a few weeks ago. I couldn't have named them, and I was interested to see if other people could name them, because it suddenly occurred to me, I can't believe we look at these three stars all the time and maybe don't know the names. So I put out a poll, 90, and this was as of last count, which was almost an hour ago. There were 98 participants in this poll. And I kind of tried to mix it up by saying, did you think these three stars were called Alnitak, Safe, and Bellatrix? Did you think they were Alnitak, Sirius, and Rigel? Did you have no idea at all? Or did you know that they were Alnitak, Anilam, and Mintaka? And the results weren't so bad. 44% got it right. 44% knew it's Alnitak, Anilam, Mintaka. Although this might be skewed a little high, because it was sort of aimed at Slooh followers, Twitter followers, and did hashtag astronomy, so maybe I was getting sort of people who are more familiar with it. And 90% said they had no idea at all, so were like me. But if you sort of think, maybe this is skewed a little high, it's still interesting to me that less than half, and maybe like more, maybe we're looking at more like 25% really, if people know these names, and yet they're above us so often, and we refer to them and we look at them and recognize them, but we've just sort of lost that connection digging in deeper and looking at them and getting to know them intimately. Okay. Brilliant. So our Nitak is another hot blue supergiant. Actually, it's the brightest O-type star in our sky, and it's 20 times more massive and 10,000 times more luminous than our sun. And it's already begun to die at a mere 6 million years of age. Just the numbers when you start to look at the cosmos really blow your mind. 6 million years old, and it's just baby, really. Eventually, it's going to swell into a red giant, like Betelgeuse. It has a Horsehead. It has a companion, and one of the reasons it's sort of most well known within the belt is because it has the lovely Flame Nebula above it and the Horsehead Nebula below it. And unfortunately, we can't see the Flame Nebula tonight. Just the way the telescope is in Chile, I couldn't get it on. But one of our members did take an amazing shot, so I thought I might share that with you. Let's have a look. There we go. This is Kevin W. One of our members took this shot, which is just phenomenal, and you can see our Nitak there, kind of almost lighting up the Flame Nebula, which is interesting in its own right because, as we'll talk about next week, the belt was seen by one culture in South America as actually being fire sticks, which is perfect for the Flame Nebula because here it is lighting it up. So great shot there from our member, and I'll just leave that up for a little bit. So you can have a look at that, but also, some great missions that you can launch a mission to the Flame Nebula and get some great shots yourself. Okay, let's have a look. What else can we talk about the belt? Well, actually, one of the things I did want to talk about is mentioned some members are trying to get together and look together at maybe doing some sort of mosaic, and one of the mosaics that has been suggested is doing a deep dive into the belt. There's so much juiciness there, and then we'll see the sword hanging from the belt and the Great Orion Nebula next week. So if you're interested in that, then certainly hop onto the discussion board and just, you can start a new thread if you can't find the thread that's being talked about, and just say, hey, I'm in, if you want to get together and do a mosaic, because it'd be really wonderful to see some more in-depth detail. So I wanted to talk, sort of switch up to a different story. We're here to talk about stories and myths after all, and it's not all astrophysics and science. And so I thought I'd share with you a story from Egypt, from ancient Egypt, and see what you think. So some people say that Orion is represents Osiris for the ancient Egyptians, and some say Horus instead. Personally, I think Horus is more compelling, but who am I to say? So I wanted to share with you this sort of condensed myth of both Osiris and Horus, so you can decide for yourselves whether there are any similarities with the tales told earlier. And this is from Philip Wilkinson's book, Myths and Legends. It's an illustrated guide, and it's a really gorgeous book by Dorling Kinsley. So while we are musing on the Reflection Nebula right now, M78, beautiful, I'm going to tell you this story, and you can decide for yourself, is Orion Horus or Osiris? I think it's pretty obvious. So the first king of Egypt was the god Osiris. Like some rulers of Egypt after him, he took his sister Isis as his wife, and he was a good king, much liked by his people. And Isis was a popular queen, but Osiris had a wicked and violent brother, Set, who was jealous of Osiris's power and lusted after Isis. So to get rid of Osiris, Set tricked the king into climbing into a wooden chest, which he then sealed and threw into the Nile. The river Aradnis, the constellation, is sometimes seen as the Euphrates or the Nile, by the way. And Osiris was dead by the time Isis found the box. But she retrieved the king's body, and Set discovered that she had done so, and so he hacked Osiris's body into many pieces. But it's supposedly impossible to destroy the body of a god. So Isis decides to salvage all these pieces of the body, a bit gruesome, which is pretty apt as we're looking at this eerie nebula now. And with the help of her sister, who happened to be the wife of Set, she gathered the fragments of his body and joined them together and bound them tightly to make the first mummy. And then, transforming herself into a bird of prey, a kite, she hovered over the body, beating her wings to infuse it with the breath of life. And Osiris breathed for just a moment, long enough to impregnate Isis. And then he departs for the underworld. So Isis then flees from Set, taking with her a guard of 7 scorpions. So interesting how the scorpions show up again. And while she's fleeing, Isis is treated inhospitably by a rich woman, and because the scorpions were quite sort of protective, they bite the woman's child, and Isis takes pity on this child and uses her magic to cure the infant. And some say it was sort of like blinded. So she cures this infant, but later when she gives birth to her own son Horus, he in turn is bitten by a scorpion, and she's used up all her power now, all her healing power, so she can't cure him. But fortunately, Ra, the sun god, sees Isis in distress and sends the moon god Thoth to cure Horus of his blindness. Meanwhile, Set has usurped the kingship in Egypt, and when Horus grows up, he challenges his uncle to the throne, and the two have many battles. And now we're sort of really seeing this reflection nebula come in. And on one occasion, Set blinds a sleeping Horus again. And then Set tries to rape Horus, gets pretty weird, and tells the other gods that the young man was unworthy to be king because he'd slept with his uncle. But the gods find out that Set was lying. And finally, Set challenges Horus to a boat race, insisting that the vessels used in the race should be made of stone. And Horus tricks his uncle by using a wooden boat that he sort of plasters to look like stone. And Set's boat sinks, and in his anger, he turns himself into a hippopotamus and capsizes Horus's vessel. There's just no end to this Set's evil doing. But the gods at last see that Horus is truly worthy, and they make him a king. Meanwhile, Set is exiled. And interesting, the hippo was a constellation, but it's no longer recognized. And interestingly, would have been Scorpio was part of this constellation. So entirely up to you whether you think Orion was closer to Horus or Osiris. I won't try and convince you otherwise. So we just passed by the Reflection Nebula. That was 1600 light years away, and part of the Orion cloud complex that we're going to see in greater detail next week. But I didn't want to miss that chance to show you the Reflection Nebula. It wasn't on my list, but as I say, because the Canaries closed tonight, it got added. So, and one thing that is inspiring about the Reflection Nebula is that it's creating new things all the time. There are new things that are emerging in this. I sort of realise it's not static. We think it is. But in 2003, J. McNeill of Kentucky found a new object in the Reflection Nebula, another small nebula. There are a few nebulae, actually, within the Reflection Nebula. And it got named the McNeill Nebula after him. So fantastic. And he was an amateur astronomer, apparently, who kind of just got lucky and now has this nebula named after him, the McNeill Nebula. So I thought that was inspiring us to keep on looking through the telescopes. You never know when we'll spot something new. So now we are, where are we, 9:50? Yeah, we are back on Betelgeuse. So we missed it at the beginning, really, because it was a bit late to start. So now we get to have a really good look at this beautiful star. And if you're on the main page, I'm just gonna switch back a moment to the picture that inspired me at the beginning. There we go. Can I do it? Here we go. So we can see Orion in all his glory, and we can see Betelgeuse there. If you're over on that page, on the main page, you can see Betelgeuse in its sort of beautiful, beautiful orange glory, described, as I mentioned before, as ruddy, but by Ptolemy, always sort of inferred as him meaning ruddy, but I kind of see it like as a russet, yeah, super beautiful, a mythic all on its own, this lovely star. So kind of just wanted to wrap up a little bit here, and I wrote about this on in Illuminations in a post about how mythic this constellation is, and I referred to this picture by Rogelio Bonao Andre. Sorry, it's just, you know, to me it's just unbelievable. But and I talk about this idea that, you know, what is a myth, and one of the reasons is that what I discovered, and actually I have to thank Christina, one of our members, who brought this up on a discussion board when I was asking about, you know, what do you like about this particular constellation, and she mentioned that Betelgeuse is getting near the end of its life, and in fact could explode into a supernova really at any point. Although several scientists have suggested maybe not for 100,000 years, which is pretty, you know, again, it's pretty soon in cosmic years, but some people are sort of hopeful it's going to happen fairly soon, and also sort of sad at the same time because we'd lose it. But it sort of suggested that when this explodes in a supernova, it'll be visible to humans on the planet, and will be as bright as a full moon. And the matter that it lets off, we won't feel the shock for something like 6 million years, I read. I don't know how people know exactly, but we definitely wouldn't be sort of negatively impacted on Earth. And so, you know, Betelgeuse itself is mythic. Even though we're talking about, you know, the facts, and this is a star, even the story of Betelgeuse is kind of phenomenal. This idea that it's getting near the end of its life, and is going to sort of explode in this supernova and be as bright as a full moon, and then be gone. So if you can sort of imagine looking up for Orion and this wonderful red giant no longer being visible, and people sort of talking of stories and maybe making up stories about a red giant that once lived or was on the shoulder of Orion. Maybe they'll say he was like the dwarf that we talked about earlier, and then disappeared one day. So it's sort of interesting to think about how we're creating myth and story really all the time, and how lucky we are to live in such an incredibly rich story. And again, I sort of look at this photo, and I'm just amazed by just one constellation, how incredibly deep it is and how inspiring that is, and how the imagination just starts to run riot. So I thought it was a lovely way to end this evening, was to look at Betelgeuse. And also, I must confess, there was no other object I could look at through Chile for our final few minutes. They were all out of sight. So Betelgeuse it was destiny. It was a story all of its own. So thank you for joining me this evening for this first part of taking a look at Orion. So next week, as I mentioned, we're going to be going below the belt, looking at his sword, the Great Orion Nebula, the Running Man Nebula. Got some amazing pictures from members that we're going to be sharing on those too. We'll be looking at Rigel and the nearby Witch's Head Nebula, which to me is the luck dragon. I wrote about this too on Illuminations. We'll be looking at Safe, the star of Orion's left foot or left knee, some people say. So maybe we'll squeeze in the Flame Nebula as we missed it this week. But we'll be looking at a whole different set of stories. The Mayans, Peruvians, South Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, Mexico, up into North America, from tales from indigenous cultures about what they saw. And I think you'll be surprised that they didn't see a hunter, as was seen elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Also, as I mentioned, if you're keen to get involved and take some photos, you can become a member. And here's Betelgeuse starting to get hot. You can become a member, and as I say, just post in the community board, on the discussion board, a new thread. Don't worry about where it goes. We'll sort it all out. If you want to get involved in working on a mosaic, maybe of Barnard's Loop, this beautiful semicircle on the left of the gaseous clouds. The Orion cloud complex. Orion's so full of these beautiful nebulae and clouds. It's called the Orion's cloud complex. We'll look at that in more detail next week. But if you want to get involved, you could certainly post on the discussion board and ask how you could do that. I know some members have been saying how much easier this would all be if we had a constellation cam running, and it's coming. I don't have any more information than that, unfortunately. So a few things coming up on Slooh I just wanted to point out before I go. Obviously, I'm back next week, same time. I'm here every week talking about constellations and their myths. But on Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. on Slooh, every week, I think it's 12 weeks, Dr. Paige Godfrey is doing an introduction to astronomy. And this week she's going to be talking about measuring the light curve of objects, and how by doing that astronomers can determine composition and rotation and age and evolution. So that's going to be wonderful. And hopefully astronomer Paul Cox will be back with us next Sunday. He'll be all better, hopefully, with his practical astronomy. So he's here on, as I mentioned, Sunday. I think he starts at 7 and runs for a couple of hours. And he talks about how to get the most out of being a Slooh member. How to use the telescopes, how to take pictures, how to put mosaics together, all sorts of juicy things. And he also talks about the best things to see in our night sky on the week ahead. And one of the reasons I'm picking the constellations is because you can go out and see them right now. So and one of the wonderful things about Orion is you can see it in North and Southern Hemisphere. But you can go out right now, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, take a look at Orion. So I encourage you to go and do that. It's really great to see it this time of year. It's all sort of twinkly, and maybe you can look up and try and remember the names of the stars in the belt, and have a look for that sort of dark area beneath Alnitak that might be the Horsehead Nebula. Of course, though, I know it's pretty cold, so make sure you wrap up if you're in a cold area. I gather from one news report that in New Hampshire, up Mount Washington, it was actually colder than Mars. So, a couple of nights ago, colder than probably a day temperature of Mars. So that's kind of interesting. So make sure you wrap up if you're popping outside to have a look up. But I think winter's a really lovely time to see the stars because you get these really crisp skies. And then at the end of this month, we have the blue moon lunar eclipse, which is going to be, wait for it, legendary. It's going to be epic and mythic all of its own. And there'll be a few of us on to talk about what all that means. So we've got lots coming up for you on Slooh, we hope to see you either in the discussion board. Maybe you want to post something in Illuminations if you're inspired. Maybe you want to share the pictures that you've taken on our member board. Maybe we'll see you on Twitter or over on Facebook. And as always, it's a pleasure, and we wish you clear skies and encourage you to keep looking up.